Y'all want to see a magic trick? Yeah! Let's set the mood. Wow, how about that? So Pastor Paul.
Yeah.
Good. All right. They'll be asking for you to make me disappear in a moment. You may be seated. Thank you so much, David. Well, that's cool. I knew we had that working on. Didn't know that was all done. That's great. Well, good evening, everyone. It's good to see you. And tonight we're going to be continuing a study we began last week. Before I get into those comments, let me give you a reminder. Charlie Meadows is over here. Was it 2 years ago, Charlie, or a year ago?
Yeah, it was a year ago, February.
Year ago, February. Yeah, we had Dr. Karl coming in to be speaking about global warming. And just as God's sense of humor would have it, Cal was here after his first session. He was supposed to be here for an entire week, and he was going to be speaking around the state. But after the first session is when we had that last really big polar spell, where we had like 14 inches of snow and ice, and literally the whole week got wiped out. They spent the week out with Charlie and Linda, able to get... Yes, sir?
He never got to speak before the congregation. It was the paper he passed in London.
Really, that was it?
That was it.
Oh, wow. Well, you know the subject that I was speaking about last Sunday, and I'll be speaking about it again, or part two this Sunday, but much of the material, the resources that I accessed are on the table over there, from visiting with Dr. Beisner and the Cornwall Institute, the work that they do, some great videos. Matter of fact, we showed one of those videos. We called the producer that Climate Hustle 2 with Kevin Sorbo. We called the producer and had permission to show that week, and we showed it to our congregation online live stream, since we weren't able to have church because we had over a foot of snow out there. But some great materials over there, and they have been left in Charlie's garage. And actually, we had intended on bringing Dr. Beisner back, but for one reason or another, it just has never materialized. So there are some great resources over there that we offer to you. The money does not go to us. We still have all those books on good faith from Dr. Beisner. So whatever we sell, we'll send to him, and then any materials that are left over, we'll send to him. But I invite you to check out the table. Well, I said last Sunday that one of the reasons it's important that Pastor Dan and I do what we do in teaching the whole council is that we've been called to make disciples. You know, I've grown up in church and had some of the great pastors of all time. I've had the privilege of hearing. Aunt Lucy and Uncle Walter were members of Jack Hyles Church up in Hammond, Indiana for many years, and got to attend there whenever we were up there. In fact, as a football player, I got special treatment and got to go back and see Dr. Hyles and do a few things up there. Of course, Dan's mother used to sit under Dr. Ironside at the great Moody Bible Church. I got to hear Dr. Rice as a child on some of his Sword of the Lord crusades. And, of course, Mom and Dad taking me when I was really too young to realize exactly what I was being able to be introduced to. But, you know, as pastors, we've been called to make disciples. And for most of our congregation, I can't say all, but most of our congregation are believers. So we don't have to have John 3:16 every week. Now, although you know how heavily we emphasize apologetics. And you know, as you exit both exits, you can get our booklets on not blind faith. You have plenty of materials for soul winning that's available to you. But you know, much of what we do is to teach you to think like a believer in every area of your life. Because I do want you to have great families. I want your kids to grow up. I don't want you to ever have to bail them out of jail. I don't want you to have issues. If we can avoid it, we want to try to avoid it. I want you to have good jobs. I want you to be able to provide for your families. So it's imperative, as you are learning, as we're going through our through-the-year Bible reading in these last 6 months. We just finished up Deuteronomy. Actually, I finished it today. You'll be finishing it tomorrow if you're on course for the Bible reading. But my goodness, the Lord goes into great details on the specific instructions for their health and well-being as a community, the people of God, or in that case, the nation of Israel. So God has given much instruction for us as followers of Christ as to how now we're supposed to live, how our families are supposed to function, how we're supposed to raise our children, how we're supposed to approach the area of economics, which largely are ignored by most pastors. But when you look at what the Bible instructs us, Paul talks about the gifts that are given to the body. He talks about apostles. He talks about evangelists. An evangelist is one that's going to be sharing the gospel. Primarily, of course, evangelism is a part of ministry. And then it talks about pastoring. Pastoring would be better translated shepherding, guiding the flock, protecting the flock, leading the flock. I'd like to think we've done a relatively good job of doing that over the last 2 years. I mean, we have really faced something that mankind, at least not in America, has ever seen. And I believe we've given good counsel to our congregation to best protect you from making bad decisions pertaining to your own bodies. And then also there is the teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I've commanded you, even unto the end of the age. So as Christians, our lives should look differently, because we should be following the Lord's instruction for how now we do live as followers of Jesus Christ. So last week we got into the study of economics. This week we're going to, actually this is part 2 or part 3? Part 2. This is going to be 3-part, maybe 4-part, the way I'm bloviating even before we get started. So we'll just see. But it is, when you see what's going on, what does Biden have out there right now? The Inflation Protection Act. It's important that you learn what truth is. If somebody sits here and tells you that 2 + 2 is 6, you need to be able to go, no, it's really not. So when someone says that we're going to pass the Inflation Protection Act, and then you look at the measures they're taking, and all it's going to do is make life worse and actually cause higher inflation, then you need to be able to recognize that so you can best be prepared. Now, worldview is how you see the world. It's a popular phrase you hear now. Thankfully, we have said it here for years. We've talked about biblical worldview for well over a decade. Now it's becoming in vogue, and thankfully that's true, because as our friend George Barna has determined with a study completed last year, only 6% of born-again or self-identifying born-again Christians actually, when tested over how they view life, actually have a biblical worldview. 94% of professing Christians think like lost people. And likewise, we saw in this last year, he did the same study with conservative so-called pastors, and found that pastors, 2/3 of conservative pastors, do not have a biblical worldview. Worldview is so important. How do you see the world? It's either one of two ways here in North America. Either a biblical worldview, which says that God is creator of all things. God is the ultimate lawgiver. There is absolute truth. Man is sinful and can't be trusted. As a sinner, man needs a savior, can't save himself. And man is free. A limited civil government is to punish evil. Other worldview here in America is the secular worldview, which basically says God isn't. Therefore, if there is no God, man is the highest among evolved life, and therefore man becomes his own God. Man is basically good, and that's why they keep focusing on things like we need to take away guns because it's not the man's fault, it's that evil gun that caused the man to go shoot somebody. Well, that's nonsense. Think about it. If that was the situation, then after Cain killed Abel, they should have outlawed rocks. And then what would David have done when he was in the Elah Valley facing Goliath? You'll get that on the way home. Man is perfectible under the right circumstances, and the purpose of government is control, central planning. For man's well-being and welfare, the government must control everything. Now, we know what the United States of America was birthed on. As a matter of fact, let me pray again. David prayed. That probably didn't count for much, so let me pray again. Is David still in here? See, he left. That's why he nailed him. Okay, let's pray. Lord, thank you for our time of study. Thank you for the freedom that we still enjoy. Thank you for the comforts that we still enjoy as Christians living in America. And we thank you for this building. We thank you for all the work that's going on tonight. And we pray that you'd bless this teaching. Help me to be clear and not chase rabbits. Lord, help me to be focused and to be able to teach our people a good lesson on your instruction for how to handle money. This we do pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Always listen. So we're built on natural law. We know what kind of worldview America was built on, the laws of nature, nature's God. And as such, a basics for biblical worldview is this. God, there's nothing new under the sun, Solomon said. And everything that we are dealing with today, whether it be abortion, whether it be the homosexual issue or any other sexual temptations, it's not new. It's been around for 6,000 years. And God has allocated responsibility to one of 4 realms of government. It's not all the civil government. We have been programmed in public education. When we say the word government, we immediately default and we get a picture in our minds of the White House or the United States Capitol. That is not true. It begins with self-government. And if you look at the creation story, that's where it began with Adam. Adam had one responsibility. Adam, don't eat of the tree in the middle of the garden. That's the only standard you've got. Obey me, self-government. Then family government. And then church government. And then civil government. So when you put into the proper category the proper issue, it all makes sense and it all works very, very well. Now, free market principles that are taught in the Bible. We're going to go through a couple of them here in review, and then we'll get into tonight's study. One, the right to own title to property. Use property as you wish. Dispose of it when you want a price, when you want for a price that you agree to. Remember, when the Jews came out of bondage, they had been slaves for over 400 years. The idea, think of these things, how crazy this was to them. The idea of having one day off every 7. They hadn't had a day off for 400 years. The idea of now having a day off out of every 7, God gave that as a gift to His people. The idea of being able to own your own property and pass it on to your children and your children's children when they had been slaves for over 400 years and hadn't owned anything was quite novel to them. You are to pay your employees on time, as we have just gone through the book of Deuteronomy. Notice how many times it deals with this particular issue. Pay your employees fairly. Don't withhold their pay, but pay them what was agreed to based upon the free market, which was taught in Matthew 20, verses 1 through 15, among many other places. What are you willing to pay? What are they willing to work for? Work was understood. Laziness was scorned. Read the book of Proverbs. About every 5th or 6th verse deals with laziness. And then the idea of being rewarding success and chastising slothfulness was an issue that Jesus illustrated himself in the parables of the talents. Now, general precepts of government taught in the Bible. Bible teaches individuals, in fact, not just individuals, but countries, churches, businesses, teaches the principle of budgeting during times of plenty in preparation for times of want. I would point out as an example, Joseph, when he was in bondage, when he was in jail. Of course, Pharaoh had his dream of the 7 plentiful years and the 7 lean years. What did they do? They budgeted in preparation. The Bible teaches us to consider the cost before you begin a project. The Bible values investing. Again, look back at the parable of the talents. The Bible says to diversify your assets for protection. I'm going to probably come back and camp on this with a little more specificity, possibly even next Wednesday night, because as we're going into some of the things we are facing as a people, of course, the stock market's up right now. That's a good thing. It's good to have your money invested. We're going to learn a little bit about inflation tonight. But you heard the old adage. You remember when we were actually taught old adages and they actually made sense? But remember the old adage, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. Well, that's what budgeting or diversifying your investment is. And I would point to when Jacob was returning to see Esau after those many years when he was at Uncle Laban's house. You remember on the way back, Jacob had accumulated great wealth. And on the way back, he was concerned that Esau was going to be hostile, so he divided his family and divided his flocks and herds, basically diversifying his assets for protection in case something went wrong. Avoid unreasonable debt service. In fact, under the law, you could only indenture yourself for so much. You could only indenture your land for so long a period of time. In the Bible, the book of Proverbs says the borrower becomes enslaved to the lender. Family is supposed to care for the family, not just, and again, the New Testament just elaborates and expands on what's taught in the Old Testament. The idea of honoring your parents wasn't just paying lip service and giving a Mother's Day card and a Father's Day card. The idea of honoring your parents was to take care of them in their old age, as the parents were to take care of their children when they were young. And then, of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, slothfulness is attacked throughout the Bible, whether it's in Proverbs or whether it's in Psalm, or whether it's Paul affirming to the church in Thessalonica that if a man just is lazy and chooses not to work, then let him go hungry. That's a great motivator. And then the biblical economic fact number one, as we got into the nuts and bolts of our lesson, it all begins with working. You know, don't expect a check just to show up in your mailbox. Oh, I guess I got to take that back. Over the COVID pandemic last couple of years, I guess checks did show up in your mailbox. But anyway, we'll learn how that doesn't work in just a minute. It all begins with work. And then we looked at the Hebrew word avodah and how it's translated both work, as in Genesis 2, Exodus 34, and worship, as in Exodus 8, service in Exodus 12, and service in Joshua 24. And then when you bring that forward and understand that Paul said to the church in Colossae and other places that we aren't just to work hard when the boss is around and then slack off when the boss isn't watching. Actually, our work is a form of our testimony. And how we work is actually a testimony unto the Lord. So everything we do, we should do to the glory of God. We looked at point number 2, that money is neutral. We've been taught that money is evil. No, it's not. Money is just a store of labor. It is more efficient than working on a barter system. You can accumulate and store your labor at the time that you perform it, and then you have it to spend on a product that you need when you need it. What's sinful is being in love with the idea of riches. The love of money is the root of all evil. And as I said last week or the week before, you don't have to be a rich man to be guilty of this. In fact, some of the greediest people are people that don't have a substantial amount of means. Number 3, all economic systems are capitalist systems. We had the Cold War, we had the idea of capitalist America versus communist Russia. Actually, that's not true. Let me show you this video, which I showed you a couple of weeks ago, but this will be a refresher. Well, I'm going to attempt to. Hold on just a second. That is worth... Is the volume on upstairs, Dan, or is it just me down here with this? Don't have any sound, okay. I'm on headset. Should be. Well, we got sound there. Who says we don't have sound? Yeah. There we go.
Karl Marx was the founder of communism. He believed that the ends justify the means. So lying, stealing, even murder was okay if it helped to accomplish the goal of establishing socialism and ultimately communism. Well, one lie being told today is that socialism is good for the people, but capitalism isn't. The truth is, all economies use capital. Capital, by definition, is the sum of goods or services needed for production. So that would include such things as a boat if you happen to be a fisherman, or a tractor if you were a farmer, or a factory if you're in the manufacturing business. The difference is who owns the capital. So socialist economies are capitalist economies, and free market economies are capitalist economies. But in a free market, private citizens only control the capital. We're free to buy and sell and do what we want when we want. We're free to work where we wish and do what we wish. But under socialism, the government owns everything, and that includes the people. The government tells you what to do, when to do it, where to live, what to eat. The government demands you work and then decides what they're willing to pay you. So what's the difference between socialism and a slave plantation? Absolutely nothing. Remember this, he who owns the tools makes the rules. When economic freedom is lost, political freedom perishes with it. Socialism is all about government control of everything. Socialism is evil.
So the difference in those economic systems is who owns the capital. Now, when God established the nation of Israel, who owned the capital? The individuals did. The families did. It's been passed down from generation to generation. Now, there's a false idea that the first church established communism. No, they did not. Remember the introductory slide, 4 realms of government. This government right here, is this self, family, church, or civil? What we're dealing with, church government. That's exactly right. And who constitutes the church? Individuals. Peter made the statement to Ananias and Sapphira, was it not your own property? You could have done whatever you wanted to with it. But the idea at this time was there was a crisis. There were great needs in the church because of the situation. And they had many parts of the church, members of the church family that had need and weren't able to feed themselves. So others were out of generosity, this is the act of charity, sold, gave, and the church distributed, and all the needs were met. This was not communal government. This was the church acting like the church and taking care of those in need. Then we learned that socialism and communism never works. We talked last week briefly about how even at Plymouth Plantation, because the way their venture was financed, they actually had investors back in Old England. So the Pilgrims were required to attempt communal living initially, but it failed miserably. They only flourished once they had their own private plots of property.
Why socialism doesn't work. Lesson number 2. Why work? The founder of modern socialism and communism was Karl Marx. His vision was from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. But does that really work? Imagine being in a college classroom. You're preparing to take your first exam of the semester. As is always the case, some students studied a lot and worked hard in preparation, while others did not. After the test, the grades are posted. And as you'd expect, some students earned A's, some B's, C's, D's, and some flunked the exam. So your socialist professor announces, some of you did really well, but some of you didn't. So in fairness, I decided to take the sum total of all your test scores and divide it by the number of students in the class, and that way you'll all have a 75, which is a C in a passing grade. Well, the students that didn't study thought that was great, but the ones who did study said, why work so hard if we all get the same grade? So for the next test, the bad students still didn't study, but the good students said, if we aren't rewarded for our work and sacrifice, we aren't studying either. This time when the tests were graded, there were no A's and B's to make up for the failing grades and bring up the class average. And everyone failed the course. That is socialism in the classroom, and that's why socialism has failed in every country that's ever tried it. Ask yourself, whether it be the old Soviet Union, Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, why is every socialist country run by a dictatorship? And why has socialism failed in every country that's tried it? Socialism never works. Socialism is evil.
Thank God it's Monday, said no one ever. Why? Because we enjoy having a little bit of time off. We love the weekends. The reason that we work and work so hard is because of the, obviously, the consequences of it. Well, actually, God designed us to work, but you all know good and well that if you could spend a day on the golf course or a day in the salt mine, you would choose golf course. Why? Because work is work. And the reason that we work so hard is the opportunity of reward. We get that paycheck. We're able to provide for the needs of our family. Then we learned also last week that all government spending is inefficient and wasteful. This is a critical lesson right here because this explains why the larger the government, why the poorer the people.
Lesson 3, why government spending doesn't work. In Lesson 1, we learned that all economies use capital. The difference is in a free market, citizens own the capital. Under socialism, the government owns everything. Government spending is always inefficient. It's not a Republican or Democrat thing. It's human nature. Let me explain. There are 3 types of purchases: first, second, and third party. First party purchasing means you're spending your money to purchase a product or service you intend to consume. Naturally, you're concerned about both price and quality. Second party purchasing means spending someone else's money on something you intend to consume, or spending your own money on something someone else is going to consume. In the prior example, you aren't at all concerned about price because you aren't paying, but you sure are concerned about the quality. In the latter example, you are concerned about the price because you're footing the bill, But since you're not consuming it, you're a little more flexible on the quality. Third-party purchasing is when you're spending someone else's money to purchase a product or service that someone else is going to consume. Consequently, you're neither concerned about price or quality. All government spending is third-party purchasing, and by its very nature is concerned about neither price nor quality. That's why there's always waste, fraud, and abuse in government programs. Socialism has never worked. Ask yourself, whether it be the USSR, Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, why is every socialist country run by a dictatorship? And why has socialism failed in every country it's been tried? Socialism is evil.
All right, that's what we covered 2 weeks ago. This is fresh material tonight. Number 6, taxation without consent is slavery. Taxation without consent is also theft. Ultimately, it becomes slavery. Initially, it's theft. Now, here's how taxes are supposed to work. The people create the government. The people recognize that whatever services they want their government to provide has to be paid for. So the people then determine how that's going to happen. You can either have import taxes, export taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, income taxes, or when you live in a free country like ours, you can have all of them. Yay! But anyway, it's up to us to determine how much government we want and how much we're willing to pay for. But you don't have a right to take something that belongs to someone else because it's not yours. It's their own private property. We fund the government, we decide how much we want, and then we know we have to pay for it. If we want more government than what we can pay for, we have to diminish the size of government. We are in control. It's we the people. Now, the idea of stealing someone else's life or property and recognize that your life is your most precious of your private property is so important that God placed it multiple times in the Ten Commandments. As a matter of fact, on equal footing with don't worship false gods is don't take another man's life and don't take another man's wife or another man's stuff. In fact, don't even lust after them, because we know that all actions begin in the heart, begins with thought before it becomes actual activity. Now, let's imagine that your neighbor owns 2 televisions and you don't have any. So you say, hey, I need a television. He's got 2. That's not fair. Never mind that he's worked and budgeted and bought them. And never mind that you've wasted all your money on lottery tickets. It's still not fair, because we're not concerned about equality, we're concerned about equity, which are 2 different things. So, when your neighbor goes out to dinner, you break into his house and you take a television and you go put it in your house. Liberalism calls that fairness, as now you both have a television. But what have you done? You've actually stolen something that doesn't belong to you. Rather than actually working hard and producing something, you just decided to redistribute his wealth. By the way, what does the Bible say about that? Emphatically, thou shalt not steal. Redistribution of wealth is a political way of legalizing theft, which God frowns on. So, what's the instruction? Work 6 days unto the Lord, budget, save, whatever. We're supposed to be fruitful. Now, understand that redistribution goes both ways. As they try to redistribute and take things from those that have to give those that don't, what they also do is redistribute poverty from those that don't to those that have. Theft doesn't produce anything, as we're seeing in Chicago, as we're seeing in San Francisco, and other places around the country that are run by Democrats, where we no longer are enforcing the law. Eventually, every time it leads to this. Now, what if those 2 televisions were sitting there in that house and the government decided we needed to redistribute? Does it make a difference? Does the government own those TVs? Nope, sure doesn't. So let's say that the government says, hey, it's not fair, some people don't have as much as others, so we're going to redistribute those that have too much. And notice who gets to define who has too much, not those of us that have worked hard to accumulate it, to redistribute to those that don't have any, and wind up with the same outcome. Out of fairness, we'll take from the man that has 2 and give the one that doesn't have any. Not only does this punish the man who's worked hard and done things the right way, but it also rewards the man that doesn't do things the right way, which is what Paul addressed specifically in the letter to the Thessalonians. This is an same example, the same equivalency of the crook breaking into the house, only this is done also by force, only it's the government choosing to do so. So recognize the difference here between proper government and improper government. The people constitute a limited government. It's of, by, and for the people. All money belongs to the people. The people must fund the government they create. The people decide how much of their money they're willing to give to fund their government. Improper government, the government owns and controls everything directly or through regulatory agencies. By the way, that includes your own person. It's part of the reason this whole vax discussion was coming up the last 2 years. Whose body does your body belong to? Who do you belong to? It's up to you to make that determination whether you want to inject some experimental mRNA process into your body or not. It's not the government's decision to make. The government decides what it will do and how large it will be, and then the benevolent government generously allows you to keep some of your money. Don't you love it when the Democrats talk about tax cuts and how that's wrong? You always hear, pay your fair share. Folks, pay your fair share means theft. Now let me look at a few things here. A graduated income tax is theft. And that's one of the things that the Marxists wish to establish. Do you know what a fair tax is? Again, there are a few people that don't believe we should have any civil government. I'm not one of them. I like being able to call the police and have the police come over and arrest a guy that's breaking into my neighbor's house. I have actually, years ago when we lived on Pawnee, I actually had my gun one night and went over to my neighbor's house when there was a break-in. Fortunately, I didn't find anybody there, so it wound up to be a non-issue. But I would rather be able to call the police. I am all in favor of streets and sewer systems. So I am in favor of having a limited amount of my income go to fund the civil government. However, a graduated income tax is unfair. Because a man who earns, well, here's what a fair tax means. A man who earns $50,000, if he was charged or paid a 10% flat tax on his income, would wind up paying $5,000 in taxes, obviously. A man who earns $500,000 would pay 10% of his income, would be $50,000. Is that the same? No, one is paying more in money. However, they are both in for the same level of commitment. To sit here and for me to say, you know what Doc earns? Nobody needs to earn more than $200,000. That's just not, so anything over $200,000, I think we need to tax it 90% income tax. Because nobody needs that kind of money. Is his body his? It's his. Is his labor his? Is what he charges up to him and his clients? Yeah, is what he earns his property? I have no say-so over it, do I? Doesn't matter whether he makes $100,000 or $500,000. It's his property. And don't you love the way they always determine that it's you that's driving too nice of a car, or you are living in too big of a house, or you are earning too much. It's never them. But a graduated income tax is literally legalized theft. As a matter of fact, I love what Thomas Sowell said, the famous economist, said, what exactly is your fair share of what someone else has worked for? And then recognize, now this is straight from the IRS, 10% of the population actually pays 71% of the taxes. Nobody ever points that out, do they? Does that sound fair? Well, that's the way the system works. So don't ever fall for this idea that the rich are greedy and they're not paying their fair share. The reality is, if you wandered down a dark alley and you ran into these guys who demanded your wallet against your will, what would you call that? Theft. So if you wandered down that same alley and you ran into those same five guys, but instead of having a gun, they said, we believe in democracy. We want to vote over whether you should give us your wallet or not. And you took a vote, and it was 5-1 that you should give your wallet to them. What is that? Theft. It's the same thing. Benjamin Franklin made the statement that democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. Actually, I said 2 wolves voting that the lamb pays 50% income tax while they collect welfare. Understand that. Additional note about economics, if you want more of something, then you subsidize it. If you want less of something, then you tax it. Remember several years ago when Governor Fallon, I think, was in office, where they instituted the sin tax on cigarettes, where they're charging like $2 or $3 a pack. Now, I'm not a smoker. I don't advocate smoking. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the effort by the government was to get people to smoke less. So in order to accomplish that, what did they do? They taxed you $3 a pack on a pack of cigarettes. You know, I'm old enough to remember when you can, I never was a smoker, even in my young days. The cigarette machines used to be like 50 cents for a pack of cigarettes. Now you walk into Walgreens, it's like, you got to take out a second mortgage if you're going to buy a car. I don't know how anybody can afford, but that's the purpose of tax. More taxes reduces your intention or your desire to do something because it's punishing. If you want more of something, you subsidize it. Now, let me ask you this. With that basic economic fact, why is it that we increase the income tax rate for the more successful a person is, basically saying we want to diminish your being successful, yet we subsidize unwed mothers? What are you going to get more of? Now again, you say, oh, Pastor, you're just not very compassionate. I am compassionate. First thing I would want to do with, quite frankly, as we're having the issue now, as abortion is in the process of being rolled back, as Roe versus Wade has been reversed, there's the question, well, who's going to adopt all those kids? Well, quite frankly, we should be there to adopt the kids, but more than that, we should be teaching proper morality. We should be teaching the proper place that God created sexual behavior for. That's within marriage. So we should be teaching our children, rather than trying to teach them the LGBT agenda from age 3 and up. We should be teaching them values and biblical morality. That actually would take care of it. And then, of course, when there is a charitable need, which realm of government is supposed to be the one that deals with it? The church government, not the civil government. We do a much better job because we look at each other, we see each other eye to eye, we are accountable, we're able to monitor, we're able to disciple. And I'll tell you, we've had people knock on our door that are just hitchhiking up I-35 needing a handout. You know what we do? I don't think we've ever turned anybody away. Now, we may give them a gas card to QT that's only good for gas so they can't go buy beer or something with it. I don't think we've ever turned anybody away, even somebody that we don't know. However, the way it's designed is the church is supposed to minister within the body. So when we have somebody that we know and we go to church with and has an issue and needs some sort of charitable assistance, it's up to the church body, family first, church body second, to take care of it. Never is it supposed to be the government's job. And then finally, additional note number C is corporations don't pay taxes, people do. Now you're going to hear this a lot right now with this new Inflation Reduction Act, which does the exact opposite. Within it, they have a flat 15% corporate tax, which says they say corporations don't pay any income tax. Well, the reality is corporations shouldn't, because people pay taxes. I promise you, those owners, the stockholders within the corporation, are paying taxes. Now, what do you think happens when a business's cost of doing business goes up by 15% because of 15% tax hike? Your cost of the product is going up. So don't let them say, oh, this isn't going to affect the middle class. We're taxing those evil corporations. I got news for you. You and I are going to be the ones that are paying that tax at the end of the day. It's the only way it's going to work. They can't afford to stay in business if they can't afford to stay in business. Daniel Webster, the famous orator and congressman, made the statement, the power to tax is the power to control and to destroy. Point number 7, inflation is an invisible tax. You hear inflation. What is inflation? Inflation, by definition, is too many dollars chasing too few goods and services. But basically, it's comprised of two components, products and currency. And quite frankly, the amount of both. When things become more rare, they increase in value, which is why a mint condition Mickey Mantle baseball card, rookie card, is so valuable, because you cannot find them anywhere anymore. They aren't around. Money used to also have a limited value. As a matter of fact, at one time, money was backed by gold. As a matter of fact, as you can see on the screen here, you could take a dollar or a $20 bill and take it down to the bank and exchange that for that much in actual gold, because money was actually backed by something. As a matter of fact, as you hear us talking about the Great Reset, understand that this is a great economic reset, and it is going to affect all of us. That's why this lesson is so important. That's why preparing for some difficult times, which very well, I hope not, we are working diligently to try to keep them from coming upon us. However, the direction that we're going right now, we will be facing let me put it this way, more difficult times than what we've been accustomed to living in for the last many decades. But at one time, a $20 bill used to actually be backed by gold. After World War II, there was an agreement made. Since America was on top of the ladder, America was the only stable country on the planet. We were the only country on the planet that hadn't been touched by war. Great Britain had been bombed out. Europe had been ravaged by war. Japan, China, the entire world had been touched by war, except for America. We had the strongest economy. We had everything rolling in our direction. And we agreed at that time that the dollar would be the world reserve standard of currency. And we promised that our dollars would be backed by gold, which we'd keep in Fort Knox and various other forts. Well, in the early 70s, under President Nixon, he was convinced that we couldn't do that anymore, and we took the dollar off the gold standard. Now, if you look at a dollar that's in your pocket, it says this. It doesn't say it can be exchanged for so much gold or so much silver. It says this note is legal tender. Why? Because the government says so. It's actually what we would call fiat currency. It's not backed by anything. The only reason we think it has value is the government tells us it has value. As long as we believe it does, I guess it's good. But recognize that there was a time in Germany's history where they were taking wheelbarrows full of paper dollars down to the store to buy a loaf of bread because they had printed so many dollars they had become absolutely worthless. Wasn't that long ago in Zimbabwe? The same thing happened just within the last decade. Now, here, let me explain how inflation works and how this does affect you. You think it doesn't because you don't feel it immediately, but I promise you it does. For the sake of this illustration, imagine that there was a total of $10 in the entire money supply of dollars in the world. And if you had $1 in your pocket, then you would possess 1/10 of the money supply in buying power. Now, as I said a moment ago, it used to be that the government had dollars that were backed by gold, and the government said, oh, we can't just print money because that would just be paper. As a matter of fact, up until just a couple of decades ago, we actually sold bonds. In World War II, they sold war bonds. Why? Because the government needed to buy ships and tanks and guns for our military to go over and fight, and you couldn't just create money out of thin air. Therefore, the people bought bonds and lent their money to the government to fund the war. But we have long passed that. Now there might be a situation where we create some sort of a crisis, and we encourage you to stay home from work, and we'll just create money and send you a check. Or maybe we need to send $50 billion to Ukraine in order to save democracy. Or maybe we need to spend money to fund windmills. Remember when you were a kid in school and you learned about windmills in Holland? But we didn't have to do that anymore. Isn't it great that we are now going in reverse? But again, if $10 is the money supply and you had $1, you had 1/10 of buying power in your pocket. Now, what would happen if they just decided, you know what, let's just double the money supply. We'll print, and we've got now $20 in the M3 money supply. What would that do to the value of every dollar that you have in savings? And every dollar that you have spent your whole life? Hey, I'm saving for retirement. I've saved all this money. I've done things the right way. I've sacrificed. I've paid off my debts, everything else. I've got all this saved over here. Double the money supply. What happens to your buying power? Cut it in half. That's exactly right. Only this is much more preferred by the lawmakers, because if they pass a tax, it gets talked about all the time on the news, and you actually feel it because you see it taken out of your paycheck. This you don't see. You just feel later. Because when you go down to the gas station, and it used to cost you $50 to fill up your Suburban, and now costs you $100 to fill up your Suburban, that's your money supply that's the value of your money being cut in half. Only they didn't send you a bill, and you don't have to write a check, but just the purchasing power is gone. Say, Pastor, what does that have to do? It has everything to do with the Bible. God deals with all of that. That's exactly what these verses deal with in establishing the law for the nation of Israel. You shall not have unjust weights or balances. What is that referencing? There was a time where if a king wanted to fund something and he didn't have enough money, they would take their coinage and maybe drill out the center to where it was a little bit lighter. It didn't weigh quite an ounce, but it still passed for an ounce. Or you shaved off the edge of enough of them, and you can create more money for yourself, and every person doesn't realize they've actually been shorted. Or you can take the gold and rather having pure gold, mix it with alloys. How many of you remember when we actually had real silver in our currency? And then it was a little bit of alloys, then a little bit more, and now it's nothing but. Guess what that is? That is violating this law. Unjust weights and measures, because inflation is theft. Just like with the 2 televisions a while ago. Your stuff doesn't belong to the government, and you don't belong to the government. You are a free citizen of the state of Oklahoma, and the state of Oklahoma is a member of these United States of America. What's yours is yours. And we do have a responsibility, as Dan talks about, to pay the right amount of taxes. However, this kind of action is nothing but theft. There's not another explanation for it. Number 8, the free market makes everyone richer. Think about this. For 5,900 years of world history, how did man get around? Walked or rode horses. Pulled a cart, had a carriage. In 1900, we also rode horses. But about that time, you had Orville and Wilbur Wright flying for the first time. 1907, you had, Henry Ford, first factories producing the Model T. We have 5,900 years of walking or riding horseback. Then you see this country birthed in 1776. You see a country that truly had a free market. And in 70 years, from 1900 to 1970, think about this. This is mind-blowing. We go 5,900 years walking and riding horses. Then from 1900 to 1970, we go from horses to cars to airplanes to rocket ships landing on the moon. How do we advance that far in 70 years when man didn't advance anywhere for 5,900 years? When you have the opportunity to be rewarded for your risk and hard work, then you're willing to take risks and work harder, and you come up with things like this. Think about what we have in our room. We have lighting. You know, for 5,900 years, how they illuminated indoors? Candlelight or lantern. Didn't change. Then we had in America, we had Thomas Edison, the invention of the light bulb. And now here we have electric lights, LED lights, we have projection screens and all this kind of stuff, all within the last century, when for the first 59 centuries, we all used candlelights. It's all because of this free market. Rather than the king owning everything and you are the king's slave and you work for him because you had to and there was no motive to be creative or work hard or anything else, you were the king's subject and everything you had belonged to the king. All the fruits of your labor belonged to the king. When Bradford discovered the same, or knew the same thing, it's actually not like this is a secret. When you're able to be rewarded for your risk and hard labor, then you work harder and you take risks. Think about how many of you, Aunt Lucy, I know some of you grew up with this. Yep, many of you know what that is. I can remember this. This was the phone that was at Graham's house when I was a kid. This was the phone I had growing up, or the wall phone. Then, of course, we got real spiffy and we went to these push buttons. Then when I was playing for the Bears, I bought a bag phone. Wow. You carry it around on your shoulder and you actually talk to people whenever you had cell coverage. In fact, I remember one year, in fact, that's back when they charged like $1 a minute. Steve was watching one of our playoff games. We were playing the Redskins, I think it was 1987. And Steve was sitting up in the stands with my bag phone, calling everybody he knew. Hey, I'm calling from Soldier Field. Yeah, the Bears are winning 14-0. He was assuming that I was going to have an additional playoff check at the end of the game. We were up 14-0 at one point. We wound up losing that game. And all I got, rather than a playoff check, was I got a cell bill at $1 a minute. But look at how we've progressed. We went from that to this, and then from that to this. We have more computer in our pockets than NASA had when we landed on the moon. You know why? The free market. Let me ask you this. Do you think God, now you guys have, hopefully you've been with us as we've read through, up through Deuteronomy now. Is God concerned about the well-being of his people? Is he concerned that they're able to feed themselves? Do you know what has reduced starvation and poverty more than anything else ever in world history? Free market. Over the last 100 years, what has happened here in the United States of America has had a greater impact on the world than anything else. Because when man is able to be rewarded for his labor, you are amazed at how creative man comes, and that is a basic biblical principle that we've already talked about. Products of the free market. We were in St. Louis a week ago. We went to the History Museum. That was a 1948. Can you imagine sitting in your living room to watch the ball game on a 9-inch screen at Thanksgiving? And then this is just a 75-inch LG. Does the free market enrich all of us? How many street people do you think have cell phones? I bet all of them. How can they afford this? Free market, largely. Televisions, I've got to tell this story, and I'm going to wrap it up for today. I didn't get through, but I hope next week I'm not going to do as much review. I've still got to finish this section, so I got about 2 or 3 more minutes. But then we're going to finish next week, and I'm going to also get into a little bit of ESG scoring. And I'm going to tie that, and you'll understand why next week. And then, by the way, let me just ask you, would you rather do a book of the New Testament or a book of the Old Testament? We start our next round of study here in about 2 weeks. Would you rather do Matthew or Zechariah? Zechariah? Good enough. Okay, we're going to do Revelation at some point in time, but we just did it about 3 years ago, so... anyway, we'll probably be living it out we'll be watching from the ramparts before we actually get a chance to do it. But Cindy and I built a house in 2003, I think, not too far from Frontier City. And we don't live there anymore. We lived there for 4 years and came back in here to town with a normal-sized lot. We had 5 acres, and mowing 5 acres was more work than we cared to do. But we bought a Sony 42-inch flat screen television, hung it on the wall. It was really cool because nobody had it at the time. It's like this thick. You know how much it cost? $5,500. Now I got a deal because I was an ex-NFL player. They only charged me $54.99 for it. Now you can buy 75-inch televisions for like $6.99. In fact, they give the 42 inches away because they're just not worth anything anymore. Why is that? That is a product of the free market. The free market enriches everyone's lives. Now, okay, I'm going to do this one. I'm sorry. Products of free market. Socialism says that there is a fixed sum of assets. Talking about fixed pie. That's why they keep talking about we have to redistribute the wealth. If you're doing well, that means somebody else is not doing well. So you must have deprived them of something, otherwise you wouldn't be doing it. That is not true. The free market expands the pie. It doesn't just continue to slice up the pie. Let me give you an example. You know, Lowe's is in the lumber business. So they buy lumber in quantity. Let's say that because they're in that business, they bought it at wholesale and they marked it up 100% so that they can make a profit and pay their bills. But it's worth it to me, so I don't have to buy a whole truckload full of lumber. If I just need a couple of 2x4s, I can just go buy a couple of 2x4s. So I do. So let's say that they have some lumber and I go down to Lowe's to buy some lumber and I pay X amount of dollars for it. I'm not being price gouged because I could choose, I could shop, I could go to Ace Hardware, I could go to Hope Lumber Yard, I could go to Home Depot, I could go to anywhere I choose to buy my lumber. So they have to be competitive in their pricing, and I buy $25, I spend $25 to buy some lumber. And I go home and I build a bookshelf. Now those of you that know me know that that would be laughable. I have tools, I buy tools only to lose them. And then look for them when needed and not find them, buy some more and lose those. Okay, so I buy $25 worth of lumber down at Lowe's, and I build a bookcase. And I decide to take that bookcase and put it on eBay and sell it. And I mark it up, I sell it for $100. Then at the same time, I sold it to a farmer. And the farmer had made money because he had taken $25 and bought $25 worth of seeds and planted his garden, and then taken the produce and sold it at the market. So he took he spent $25, took those seeds, turned it into 100. Out of that 100, he took it and invested with me because I had taken $25, bought lumber from Lowe's, and built this bookshelf, sold it on eBay. Now, what is the end result of all of that activity? Well, the end result is everyone was free to make a choice. No one was forced to do anything. Everyone made decisions that they believed enriched their lives. Because I didn't have to buy the lumber if I didn't want it. I could wait for it to be on sale. That farmer didn't have to buy the bookshelf, but he thought that it would be more valuable to have this bookshelf sitting in his living room than to have $100 in his wallet. So none of us were cheated. We all profited. But what started out as a $50 investment, $25 lumber, $25 in seed, wound up turning into $300 in wealth. So the economy is not a fixed pie. We don't gain only when someone else loses. Because of profit, there is a need for expansion. Because of expansion, there's a need to hire more people. There's a need to buy more equipment, which creates more jobs. And as people compete for business, they work hard to improve their product, to attract more customers. So there's incentive to make a better product at a lower price because you want to get a larger market share, which results in all of us becoming enriched, just as we saw with the example of the televisions and the cell phones. Now, whenever the government tinkers with something, it's always the wrong thing. Now, what you see on the screen is a simple supply and demand graph. At 8 o'clock in the morning, you might be willing to pay $4 for a cup of coffee, which at 10 o'clock at night, when you're getting ready to go to bed, you would pour it out. You wouldn't pay anything for it. It's all about the value to you at the time. Is this product worth me spending money to purchase it? And that's determined by whatever the price is, the supply and the price of the seller, and how bad I want it, and that determines what the fair market price is. Now, if the government says, you know what, those farmers, they work hard, they ought to be making more money. So we're going to put a price floor on milk because we want farmers to make more money. And we're going to make it against the law for them to sell milk for less than $10 a gallon. What's going to happen when a farmer tries to sell milk at $10 a gallon? He's not going to sell any milk. Before long, people aren't buying the milk, there's going to be a surplus. Before long, the milk's going to go bad, you're going to pour it out, they're going to shoot the cows and butcher them because nobody's buying milk, so no more keep them, and then there will be a real shortage. So it begins with a surplus followed by a permanent shortage. Now what happens if the farmer or the government says, you know what, we want to help these workers, so and we want to help the people because of inflation. Like, for example, what's going on right now with this idiot in the White House and some of his policies saying you can't raise prices. Now, if you own a McDonald's and the law says you have to pay your employees, even your part-time junior high and high school kids, a minimum of $25 an hour, because the government's here to help. And then the government turns around and says, no, wait a second, you can't raise prices. You have to sell your Big Macs for less than $4. Well, what's going to happen when they put a price ceiling, in this case, on Big Macs? Well, that McDonald's operator is going to say, I can't afford to sell Big Macs for $4 because you're making me pay my 16-year-old wet behind the ears part-time employee $25 an hour when he mops the floor. I have to charge more. No, you can't charge more. Therefore, the business owner loses money. He eventually shuts down the store, and then there is a shortage on the supply of a particular product. So every time the government gets involved with price ceilings or price floors, it's always the wrong move. And it always results in either surpluses or shortages, but in every case, it eventually results in a shortage or just the elimination of the product being available at all. Light bulb, right? Didn't even need to study for that. At one time, you know what America used to light things? Whale oil. It's a thriving business in the Northeast. And then kerosene was discovered, replaced the whale oil. And then, of course, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, and now we all have indoor lighting. Now, what would have happened if the government had decided to get involved for the well-being of the people and decided to save the whale oil jobs? Let that sink in for a moment. Where would we be today? In darkness. Adam Smith was the author of a famous book called The Wealth of Nations. It was also, along with Blackstone's commentaries, one of those popular books read by the colonists. Said this: self-interest balanced by free competition promotes society's best interest. All right, next week we got one more point to cover, and we'll pick that up next week, and then we'll get into ESG scoring, and then we will get into our study of the book of Zechariah. But I think we will, in fact, I know we will, we'll probably make some recommendations for everyone. Just, again, we're not, I'll tell you what, we'll just say some stuff, and if you all decide to listen,